Just removed the stock 4.3 wiring harness from this 1998 C1500. There it is laying on the floor. This is achievable with just a couple connections. There's a connection down there below the brake booster, another one just to the right of it, and then the main fuse block plug, the main firewall plug. It's got a Torx, I think it's like a T25 to remove it. And over here on the passenger side, there's 2 bolts, 2 screws that fasten that bulkhead to pass through to the firewall. And on the inside, up underneath by the heater motor, just 2 connectors to unhook right in here. Pretty straightforward. To ease the removal of the main wiring harness, it passes right here underneath the brake booster and the master cylinder. This bracket right here. And if you just undo the 2 bolts on the brake master cylinder, you can pull that master cylinder forward, and the whole fuse block, harness, and everything just lifts right up here, and you don't have to snake anything out. Made it a lot easier. So I'm working on this 98 Vortec 4.3 wiring harness, and we're installing a drive-by-wire, like 03, 05 style, 5.3. And I'm working on what it takes to marry the 2 harnesses. I often tell people it's very difficult to explain exactly what needs to be done. So I'm going to do my best on showing what needs to be done to connect the 2. Basically, this is the stock 98 Vortec harness, and we're going to strip out all the engine controls and sensors that aren't going to be needed. Basically, if you're familiar with my harness process, I've got a pin-out sheet that kind of goes over what to remove and what to keep. And this is kind of going to be similar. And I'm going to show you stuff that's going to be highlighted in blue that is going to be wires that connect to the LS computer. And then there's going to be optional stuff depending on, if you want to keep ABS or emissions or, stuff like that. Basically, what I've done is I've gone through all the PCM connectors and highlighted every pin, and I've made notes on each pin on how it gets connected. And what I'm looking at right here is the 4 original 98 PCM connectors, and I've depinned these using this chart. So over here with the label is all the stuff that I've got highlighted in blue. I like to put the pin number removed from, so if you need to figure out how that works, you can go back and look at schematics. Hopefully this process will work for you. Basically everything here now that was highlighted in yellow, you can weed out of the harness and remove. One wire at a time. It's a little painstakingly slow, but if you want to do a nice factory pairing job, this is how you do it. One thing to take note, the way I plan to marry this to the 5.3 harness is I'll still do the basic standalone 5.3 harness process like I have on my YouTube videos and on my website. And the plan is I'll use, I'll do the 4 fuse block, but the rest of the stuff will interface to the original 98 fuse block. So AC control is still going to go through the original 98 fuse block, and that's all going to be going through these wires. So basically there'll be a disconnect where this part of the harness will connect to the 5.3 harness for all those signals to pass back and forth. There'll be a pink wire from the 98 harness, and this will basically be the key hot that powers up the standalone harness. I think this is the simplest way I can think to explain this. There's going to be little differences for each year. Obviously, without looking at specific pinouts and schematics for every year, I can't tell you what those are going to be until you come across those and ask me questions. As you go through the harness, starting to remove stuff, I actually like to go from the connector back. So, I started with like the EGR valve. Started pulling the wires out, and some wires you'll come to a splice. So you have here like this gray with this double gray, and then I went to the splice and it was on the EGR originally. What it is on these older vehicles, GM would share a 5-volt reference with multiple devices, and the same with low references, and you'll also see ground splices and power splices. So the reason I work backwards is if I go to the EGR valve, if I find any splices, I just cut the EGR valve off of that splice, the ground reference off of that splice. I think there was another one here somewhere. And anyways, and then once it's free, I can pull the rest of the pins that went to the computer, like the 3 on here. And I did the same thing. The idle air control valve, it came out all in one piece. Throttle position sensor, it also shared a 5-volt a ground reference. Coolant temp sensor came right out. I've labeled stuff we're going to keep, like the AC cutout switch, clutch, high pressure AC recirculation. Ground eyelets and harness you'll probably keep. And the power there's power splices too. Here's the injector plug I pulled out, and it had a splice where all the pink wires went together, and I cut them out one by one. Here's the evap purge solenoid I removed. It also had a power going to splice and one pin to the computer. Map sensor, I think it had a ground splice. Eventually, you'll probably remove some of these splices, but there is a 5-volt reference and a low reference you need to keep if you're going to keep the fuel level sensor and the fuel tank pressure sensor. So you have to wire that reference circuit back to the new LS PCM, and I think I've actually got, like, here's the 5-volt reference that we've got hooked to the LS PCM to run the fuel tank, and then there's a low reference for fuel tank too. And I think this one also is for the fuel level sensor, so I'll have to look at the schematic. But yeah, I've also identified the temp sender for the gauge in the dash. It actually goes to the plug on the passenger side. And then the tack wire is actually, if you find your original coil wire for the 4.3 or the 5.7 Vortec, the tack wire is the center pin. So I just cut it, and I traced it all the way back to the firewall plug on the driver's side, and that'll be the tack wire, and that'll run to the LS PCM. I'm going to keep removing wires here and labeling as I come across them. Here, after cutting out the mass airflow sensor, the ignition module, the coil connector, a couple other things, I've actually got a splice left with just one pink wire. And this is probably going to trace back to the fuse block. So there'll probably be, this circuit will be completely unused in the swap, because again, we're going to use the 4-fuse block on the 5.3 harness. So, well, actually, if you look at this, it actually goes to another splice. See how GM really liked splices. So we'll figure out where these 2 pink wires go and see if they're both needed, and we'll go from there. I'm going to be using the 1998 starter, neutral safety switch, and all that wiring. So this neutral safety switch plug from the 98 will go back to the transmission that's going in this, which in this case is like an 05 or 03 trans. And we'll use the range switch that this will plug into. This keeps reverse lights, neutral safety switch functions, starter relay, all that functioning through the stock fuse block as we plan on doing. And all we'll have to do to send a range signal to the new LS PCM is tap into the 4 wires on this white plug. They call that range signal A, B, C, and P. We'll also be, so we'll be keeping all that wiring. We'll also be keeping the oil pressure switch for this vehicle. This particular one has 3 wires going into it. Some vehicles, GM had the oil pressure sender also acted as a fuel pump switch. A lot of people think it cuts the fuel pump when there's no oil pressure, but it's actually the opposite. This is a backup to the fuel pump relay. So in the event your fuel pump relay was to fail, this would supply power to the fuel pump when oil pressure is built. Sometimes you notice when they shut these vehicles off that the fuel pump will run after the engine's shut off for a couple seconds. And that's why this switch is keeping the fuel pump activated. So we're going to keep that in there, and we'll use the sending unit from the 98 and probably adapt the threads over. And that way the resistance is correct for the gauge, and you'll still retain that switch function. Okay, I've got this 98 wiring harness, the off the old body style truck, stripped down. kind of go over what we've done here. Starting at the fuse block, I've got the starter solenoid wire coming out of the 98 fuse block. This will jump into the 5.3 wiring harness, purple wire, since it's already routed down to the starter neatly, and the 5.3 harness will just jumper that over to the 5.3 harness. Evap vent solenoid, if you're going to keep the evaporative emissions, this was powered by the 98 harness. This is the vent solenoid that goes down by the charcoal canister. The control wire from this comes over here and will go to the 03 PCM, the 5.3 PCM. Off of the firewall plug on the driver's side, the charge indicator lamp, or the alternator, you got two options. You can plug this into your LS alternator and your charge light will work. You need to have the PCM program to shut off the diagnostics for the field duty cycle and the turn on signal, or you can just cut this. You won't have a charge indicator light and you can still look at the voltage. I've got 3 cut wires. This brown wire came from this plug that was down by the transmission. I believe this would have been for 4-wheel drive. This truck was a 2-wheel drive. I traced the gray-black back to the low range input to the PCM. The brown wire went through this plug, so the only thing I can guess is it's for a 4-wheel drive indicator on the dash. Light blue wire is a cruise control enabled signal. We're not going to use it. And the pink wire, this fed the transmission solenoids on the 98 harness. The 5.3 harness will have its own fuse block to power everything, so we won't need that power. The tack wire feeds in through this plug. That'll hook to the 5.3 computer. Underneath the fuse block plug is this 4-pin connector. This fed signals from the fuel tank pressure and fuel level sensor. And then this fed the backup lamp signal and the fuel pump power signal. Also coming out of the driver's side firewall plug was this 2-pin plug. It's a brown and a white, and that's called the EVO, or electrical variable orifice. This was a solenoid on the back of the power steering pump to control the flow rate, the volume of fluid from the power steering pump. It has something to do with the steering wheel, speed sensor. There's a module in those trucks that use that, so I left it in here. If he still has the hose with it, we'll hook it up. If not, we'll probably leave it out. Moving on down the harness, we've got some of the AC stuff. Now, I don't know if this is where it's going to be. I'm going to put this back on the truck and figure out where I want to route it. You know, may have to extend some of this. There's 2 grounds that we'll have to hook back up. That's just powering, you know, the stock fuse block and stuff. Come over here to neutral safety switch. Again, we're going to use the 98 neutral safety switch. Oil sending unit. There's a temp gauge sender. Here's another one of the AC cycle switches. I think this was for the hood light. And we didn't touch anything going through the firewall plug on the passenger side. This is everything that was removed from the harness. Coil and ignition module. O2 sensors. And on the V6 they got this 6-pin plug that went to the rear sensors. Transmission, speed sensor, crank sensor, cam sensor, mass airflow sensor, injector plug. This was a 4-wheel drive plug that had a factory blocker in it. Air temp sensor, evap purge, MAP, and NOx sensor. And then over here we took out idle air controller, coolant temperature sensor, EGR valve, some of the power feeds to the PCM that we don't need, throttle position sensor, and then some ground feeds to the PCM that we don't need. I think that pretty well covers it, and this is what we're going to splice into the LS harness, the 5.3 harness. These wires right over here are for the analog brake system. I believe this went on the master cylinder, and then these plugged into the ABS module. I'm actually going to be taking ABS out of this. The guy with this truck, he wants a cleaner look, so he's going to remove the whole ABS module, put a proportioning valve in. So all this is going to come out. Well, I've got the 98 harness in its final configuration. Gone ahead and put some new loom on it. I'll kind of go over what we've got here. From the original passenger side under dash, passenger side firewall pass through, AC cycle switch which goes on the dryer, that's the low pressure switch, hood light that runs over here. We've got oil pressure sender. These are some grounds for the 98 harness, and range switch. We went ahead and took out the AC recirculation. The AC on this is an 05 computer. There is no output from the computer for the recirculation, so we won't be able to use that anyways. I removed the ABS, cut it out completely. Went ahead and removed the EVO switch, which was, again, that's the switch on the power steering pump. The lines he got doesn't have the switch, so we're not going to use it. And we pulled out the alternator control because this 05 has a generator battery control module, so he'll have a volt gauge but won't actually have a charge indicator lamp. The rest of the wires have been rerouted just out this trunk line here. I've got the temp gauge sender wire. This will be switching into the 5.3 harness to go to 3-wire 98 LS1 type sending unit. And I also put the AC clutch and high pressure cutout wiring here. That'll wire into the 5.3 harness as well. Also have the tack wire and the starter lead. And it's pretty well ready to go in the truck and start working on the 5.3 harness. Okay, the 98 harness is back on the truck. Just got to finish bolting down the fuse center. Everything's hooked back up. Our feed to the fuel level and the fuel pump. This is a drive-by-wire truck, so this is the cruise control plug. We'll have to take 4 wires off of here. We'll need to feed into the 5.3 harness for cruise control. There's 20 wires coming out of the 98 harness that's going to connect to the 5.3 harness. And I'm going to reuse some of these connectors taken from the truck. I've got new pins and new seals, and this will give us a total of 28 or 30 cavities to pass all those wires through. So the whole 5.3 harness will just unplug and disconnect from the truck, so you have to service it or something like that. Harness routes under the brake booster like I did before to the back. That's where the drops down the oil sending unit and the range sensor and the ground. The hood light mounted. Connector for the cycle switch on the dryer. And then the firewall pass-through. I'm going to go ahead and put those ends on now. These 2 connectors. I'll post up part numbers for the pins, and I should be able to find part numbers to buy these housings new. They're not really that bad. Maybe like less than $10 for the male and female connector plus pins. I've got the connectors put on now. That's going to connect to the 5.3 harness. Put a starter through a weather pack just because it's a little bit higher current. Also, the tack module mounted right in place of the original cruise control module. And we're also going to be using a 6.5 diesel gas pedal, which will mount right in place of the stock assembly without any modifications. I've done it before, and got to swap a pin or 2 here for one of the APP sensors. Once I figure that out, I'll have that all documented. Pretty much got all the wiring done. I think it is pretty much done on this 98 pickup. I basically built the harness with the fuse block like I normally do on a standalone, but there's only a main relay that powers up the key hot circuits. Getting the feed from the auxiliary post on the stock 98 fuse block. And these connectors connect the 98 original engine harness to the 5.3 harness. You got a connector here, connector there, one for the starter. You got a 2-pin connector here for the factory 05 fans we're using on this truck, and then a 4-pin connector jumping from the 98 cruise control plug to the 05 tack module, so all the cruise control wires jump through this plug right here. And we've got the PCM mounted in the factory location. using a 95 model AC compressor and lines, and pretty well the 95 dryer hooked right up to the 98, and let all that work. This low cutout switch is part of the 98 original wiring, went across the part of the engine harness, and then the AC compressor clutch. The high cutout switch is all part of the 5.3 wiring that we added to it. And then I also added a 3-wire pressure sensor that's on the high side port, and that will help control the fans based on AC pressure.